him be interviewed on this podcast quite a bit. And sometimes he says stuff that really irritates me, but that's not hard. But because he doesn't necessarily agree with me, and that's very irritating. But this is very, very good, very informative, and there will be a link in the video to, you'll see it on the screen. I will try to get that link put into the show description on YouTube. So anyway, these are some of the things that we talk about. We talk about acceleration, convergence, logistics, understanding. Acceleration, for example, the Jewish thought, pattern is prophecy is pattern, excuse me. So in Jewish thought, pattern is prophecy. And so they look at things that happened in the past and they extract from that a pattern. So for example, we've talked about the reconciliation that occurred with Jacob and Esau at Hebron, at the tomb of Machpelah, at the funeral of their father Isaac. They will look at that and say that is something that's going to happen in the future in Israel. There will be a reconciliation between Jacob's descendants and Esau's descendants. And the Palestinians tie a lot of what they are to Esau and Edom. And we know from Genesis 36:8 that Esau is Edom. Esau married into that line. And then we know that, one of the kings, King Herod, was an Edomite, and called then an Idumean. And he was one of the guys, he built these great sites that we have today, the Temple Mount. He built the structure over the tomb of Machpelah, and he also built a structure at Mamre where Abraham got the promise of a son, the promise that the Messiah would come through his line, all the nations would be blessed. But the other thing is acceleration. So when Jesus' first coming, most of the prophecies, about 60% of them, were fulfilled in the last week, leading up to his death, burial, and resurrection and ascension back to heaven. So if that's the pattern, we could expect that all these prophecies that have been out there for a while that aren't yet fulfilled, they're going to have this compressed fulfillment near the return of the Lord, or in that period leading up to the return of the Lord. And so I think we're in that stage. And then convergence, they're all going to be happening at the same time, all these different things. And that's why we talk about these things. And the logistics, that's something we talk about because they have to have something in place. So Mark of the Beast, we don't know exactly what that technology is and what it involves. I personally believe that it involves a loyalty oath to the son of perdition, to the Antichrist, to the man of sin. That is blasphemous because we know that the people who take that mark won't be able to be saved. And so but I think they're going to I don't think they're going to get it. It's going to be very clear what they're doing. So I think because, blasphemy of the Holy Spirit is the unpardonable sin, I somehow think that there's a connection there. And I'm maybe the only one in the world that thinks that. But then also that as we get closer, there will be this understanding, and this is what we talk about in Daniel 12:8, that it's very similar. I have an eye doctor appointment tomorrow, and they always put that chart up. I always get the E. When I take off my glasses, I'm nearsighted, pretty nearsighted in one eye, more so than the other, because I memorized it. And now they're mixing them up. Have you noticed that? So you could. I used to memorize, like the 2010 line, and what are you doing, or look at the manufacturer of the eye chart when you go in and that really small fine print. But that doesn't work anymore. So, but as you get closer, even as a nearsighted person, as I get closer to that chart, being nearsighted, everything gets clear. And I think this is a picture of how things are going to be in the times as we get clear. So there's a lot of things going on. And so I look at a lot of different publications, and I may pick up some things that other guys don't pick up, and they pick up things that I don't pick up. And so I just noticed this one in the United Arab Emirates, the national publication on Friday, and I just happened to glance at it, and it's like this: groundwater levels fall at an alarming rate around the world. And that's interesting. For example, we know in the end times that the Euphrates is going to dry up, and it's already kind of drying up because Turkey's dammed up all the water that comes down into the delta there on both the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. So the flow is much, much lower. And then you add drought on top of that, which they've been experiencing. But now this is groundwater, and this is true. They said, I think it was, 2/3 of aquifers have had declines in their levels recorded in the recent years. Now that's troubling because most things in the world require water, like humans, food, washing your Tesla, I guess you even have to have water for that. But so this is something to watch out for because this has a synergistic effect on a lot of different things if there's a lack of water. And the place where there's the least amount of water is in the Middle East. For example, Jordan is probably the most water-challenged country in the world. I know talking to Joel Kramer, who the last time I talked to him was living in Amman, Jordan, and he said they get their cistern at their apartment filled up each month, and if it's gone 2 weeks to go in the month, they don't get any water. So you get that one shot to fill it up, so you've got to stretch the water. And that's true in Jordan. And then Jordan has this massive numbers of refugees from the Syrian civil war, which if I don't remember, you didn't see anybody, but how many protests have been marching up and down Fifth Avenue, Times Square, Harvard campus, all the other places that are talking about the massacre of Jews, and all the refugees and all this from Gaza, but the numbers in Yemen and the numbers in Syria are way, way higher, and nobody ever talks about it. Least of all the Arabs. It's Arabs killing other Arabs. In Assad's case, killing Sunni Arabs and nobody, or driving them out of the country, depopulating that. The Christian population of Syria went from 10% of the population to less than 2% since 2011 when the Arab civil war in Syria started and continues today. I mean, how many protests have you seen about that? So we'll talk a little bit more about that. Speaking of refugees and immigrants and everything, this has a tendency, this could blow up into something very big. I hear there's a trucker convoy that's heading towards the Texas border. Texas put up some barbed wire, razor wire, and the U.S. Supreme Court got involved and said, hey, no. Well, they didn't tell Texas to take it down. And I don't know that if they told Texas not to put any more up, but they said the federal government could take it down. But I'm telling you, I'm reading tweets from the Border Patrol Union, and they're like, Biden comes out and says, just give me more money and we'll take, and they're saying that's not going to work because all they want to do is they don't want more money to stop it. They want more money to process things faster. So people are coming in, illegals, and there's concern about these people coming in. And I see the videos. Michael Yon and others, Ben Bergwam, they put up videos. And I mean, these are military-age males coming across the border, Chinese, Muslim, and there's not a lot of women and children. And, it becomes, so here's like Yahoo News says, oh, this is just a right-wing talk of an invasion and civil war, risk a rise in vigilantism. So again, there's this constant narrative propaganda war that we're faced with these days on almost every issue. And this is going to be an election. This is The Economist, that this could actually be bad news for Biden. We are 9 months until over 9 months until the election. About 300 and, what's today, 28th? So 358 days until the next president gets sworn in for the next term. And we have, I read an article today, the longest campaign in American history because everybody knows who the two candidates are going to be, and they're the oldest. And who knows if they'll live all the time. I did see that Michelle Obama, some people that support Michelle Obama have filed papers with the Federal Election Commission about drafting her as a candidate. So there is some good news this week. Let's see. Yeah, if I don't remember to talk about that one, that I thought I copied and put something else in there. Tehran is all over the place. Iran is all over the place trying to cause trouble. So that's what the article I was going to put up was about abortion, that in Wisconsin, the Republicans put in a compromise thing. They have control of the legislature, but the Democratic governor in Wisconsin vetoed it. And so the editorial in the Wall Street Journal was, hey, who's the extremist on abortion? Because you guys don't want to talk about it. They don't want to talk about it. They just want it to be an issue. And it's going to be a big deal in the election this fall. We saw it here in Ohio with that constitutional amendment that got shoved through. And it's now part of the state constitution. It's tough. This is another one. This is a good editorial in the Wall Street Journal the other day. Marijuana is more dangerous than the Biden HHS says. Well, I think there's a lot of things that are more dangerous than the Biden administration says. This is one of them. And it talks about the fact that the marijuana of your parents that they might have smoked at Woodstock, or your grandparents might have smoked at Woodstock. I saw a picture of like a bunch of grandmas standing around with, tie-dye t-shirts and their long hair and braids, and it says Woodstock reunion, it's and old guys, with walkers and that type of thing. But what was smoked then it's much, much more potent now and actually causes psychoses. But nobody ever talks about that. And what are we doing to our kids? We're drugging them. And then, of course, across the border comes fentanyl, and fentanyl is just incredible. So here's some good news, kind of. If you remember the trucker protest in Ottawa, Canada, a couple years ago, the truckers were protesting the lockdowns and restrictions because it was affecting their business. They couldn't get across the border unless they had met certain health requirements. It was a big problem. So there were protests everywhere. There were some protests in Alberta. There were protests in Quebec. In Alberta and Quebec, they kind of shut them down. But in Ottawa, they went to the federal government and they put this thing in the Emergencies Act. Then this little, I don't know the word I want to use, this little lunatic that is the deputy prime minister and director of finance in the baby Trudeau administration. She put in these things about shutting down their bank accounts, their credit cards, because they were getting a lot of money from the United States to help fund them while they were there protesting for a couple weeks. So civil liberties groups in Canada challenged that. It went up there was a case, and Justice Mosley at the federal court this week in Ottawa issued a decision that said that what Trudeau did violated the Emergencies Act, was unconstitutionally applied. There have been some people that have been, they're going to be allowed to sue for damages, but they have to do it like within 10 days or 2 weeks from the decision if they were damaged financially because of the lockdown of their accounts and credit cards. Now, there were some in the decision where the court said, no, you weren't hurt because, yeah, you didn't have access to your money, but you could have used a different credit card or borrowed money from your kids or something like that. And they said, even the people, like if you had a joint account with your wife who wasn't involved in the protest, she couldn't do anything with money or credit cards anyway. And the court kind of said in a number of those cases, no harm, no foul. It was only a couple weeks. What's the big deal? But what if it hadn't been just a couple of weeks? It was a very strong-armed thing. And you remember her name is, I think, Christina Freeland is the deputy prime minister. And she's a World Economic Forum graduate. And she's just this, I don't know, I would call her a tyrant. I don't know how else to describe it. And, usually I would say, I'm sure in private they're a nice person, but I'm not even sure I could say that about her. And I don't know if you remember when Trudeau was doing a news conference I have the video someplace. He's up there talking, and she's over here like doing a bad ventriloquist act of what, like she's mouthing the words. So I don't know if she's reading them off of the teleprompter or not. I don't know. She's kind of a strange individual, but I'm not sure that the decision is as good as they think. In the National Post, this writer said this: his ruling is by no means sympathetic to the Freedom Convoy. At the time, this is what the judge says, at the time I considered the events that occurred in Ottawa and other locations in January and February 22 went beyond legitimate protests and reflected an unacceptable breakdown of public order. I had and continue to have considerable sympathy for those in government who were confronted with the situation. This is what the judge is saying at the outset of his decision. And the conclusion of this article in the National Post, it's written by Chris Selly. It was on, I think it was the 24th, that a federal judge would, in 100-odd pages, both sympathize with the government's decision and find it to have been ultra vires, in other words, outside their authority, and charter deficient is a pretty perfect income for a broken country like Canada. The only things that work, we mustn't do, pending appeal to the Supreme Court, at least. And so this is similar to what's going on in the United States. And what you're seeing this, even in democracies, you're seeing this breakdown. So this is why, for example, in Israel, they were trying to put through some judicial reform, and we can argue about the scope of their judicial reform. But I'm a lawyer, and I know judges. I've been in front of judges. I don't know if he's still on the bench or not. Well, I'm not really practicing up there anymore. I won't tell you who the judge was. I got a phone call from a judge once, and he didn't like the case that I had filed. He was not sympathetic to it. It was perfectly valid legally. And he said, Mr. Haller and so he calls me, and it's just him on the phone. So there's plausible deniability. And as a lawyer, you really can't record phone calls. And he says, I told you. I don't think you understood what I was telling you in our little status conference yesterday, that you need to dismiss this case, because if you don't, I'm going to rule against you, and it's going to be millions of dollars in damages, and you can appeal it, and I'll bet you're going to lose. That's exactly what he said. And I will tell you that I worked in the federal prison in Terre Haute when I was in graduate school, and they had some mafioso types from the Chicago mob that I had better conversations with. I guess that's the only way I could say it. I felt like I was being strong. My heart was literally beating out of my chest, because what do you do? And called my managing partner, and he said, let me know when you figure out what you're going to do. Thanks for your help. And but it worked out ultimately. No harm, no foul. But I know what judges can do, and I know what judges can do that have lifetime appointments, like federal judges, like this guy was. And so that's the concern that I have. And so that's why I think judicial reform was required in Israel. And it's why I'm concerned about who gets appointed to the bench here. And here we have a 5-4 decision on the Texas border. And it was the 3 Democratic judges, Sotomayor, I forget the name of that new lady, and Kagan. And then Amy Coney Barrett joined in. and then Chief Justice Roberts. And so one commentator said, yep, the 5 females on the U.S. Supreme Court all ruled against doing anything on the border. Roberts, being a female, not... It's a sexist joke. It's really funny. That's why it's so funny. Okay. You know, I always told my wife, it's like, sometimes I have to explain my jokes to her, and she never seems to enjoy them as much as I do anyway, even if I explain them. So here he says, at the outset of the proceedings, I have not reached a decision. I'm leaning to the view that the decision to invoke the Emergency Acts was reasonable, but he did conclude, but then he goes here, I mean, I've never really seen judges do this, but he says, my preliminary view of the reasonableness of the decision may have prevailed following the hearing due to excellent advocacy on the part of the counsel for the Attorney General of Canada. Okay. This case, he says at the end there, might not have turned out the way it was without their involvement. Talking about the public interest litigants, as the private interest litigants were not as capable of marshaling the evidence and argument in support of their application. So they didn't do a very good job, but I still listen to it because I'm such a good guy. And he made a conclusion. So look, it's a good decision, but it's not that weak. And we'll see what happens when these people file to get their money back. I don't know if that's going to happen. There's a lot of protests going on around the world. For example, there's the farmer protests going on in the Netherlands, in France, about restrictions that are being put on because they want to shut farmers down. These literal lunatics like John Kerry running around Davos like, wait, don't eat. And don't say anything about it because you're not supposed to be breathing either because your carbon footprint is loud. But then see an interview with Bill Gates. He says, I have probably the biggest carbon footprint of anybody on the planet. And so it seems like there's a couple sets of rules that are being put in place. So they're having this protest, and the T-shirt of the farmers there at the protest on the right. I did take a year of French, but my French teacher in high school was from Brooklyn. So I would sound, you wouldn't recognize it if I said it. And it'd be even worse than, some of the words I have a tendency to mispronounce, just because they're frozen in my head that way. But it says, leave us alone, let us work. That's what they want. They just want to work. They want to do what they're doing. And so the Netherlands, which is like the second largest the second largest agricultural producing or exporting country in the world, they're trying to shut down right now 30% of the farms because they have too much carbon footprint. And it's just absolutely insane. And natural gas, which is very plentiful, needs to be used in fertilizer. Without the fertilizer, the crops don't produce as much and people starve. But that doesn't make any difference to the betters that these governments. And then this was a professor. She set up a website to study things at the Open University in the UK. And she was fired over it. And the court finally came out and said, hey, it's okay for you to criticize that. You have the right to do that, and they shouldn't be able to fire you for criticizing this transgender movement and like having females competing in male sports. Or no, males competing in female sports. I don't think, one solution might be just have one sport, one basketball team, one soccer team, one football team, and let it's open. And I think, if they're good enough, let them play. But I would draw the line at wrestling, though. That's a different subject. But so we'll talk a little bit about digital AI and that type of thing. Here is a lady talking a little bit about some digital stuff that's being done she's speaking at Davos. Her name is Tucker. Here we go.
When there's a big big news event, a big world event, people still come to the legacy brands. We still have a lot of trust. But I think you only have to go back. I think we have to maintain that trust, and we have to work at maintaining it in a way that we didn't have to do not so long ago. So if you go back really not that long ago, as I say, we owned the news. We were the gatekeepers, and we very much owned the facts as well. If it said it in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, then that was a fact. Nowadays, people can go to all sorts of different sources for the news, and they're much more questioning about what we're saying.
I think she might be the editor of the Wall Street Journal. And so this was a big topic at Davos, disinformation. You're going to hear that a lot, disinformation, misinformation. And the way they define disinformation or misinformation is the stuff you're going to believe. It's not true. And so there's going to be these narratives. So the other thing they talked about some at the World Economic Forum meeting last week in Davos, and believe me, there are dozens and dozens of hours of videos that I haven't begin to go through yet. But someday I'm going to do a really long one and torture you with just clips of all of that garbage. But here's a panel on digital ID. And the person speaking, I believe, is the Queen of the Netherlands. It was just kind of interesting, and it just kind of listen to the way she talks. Like, I don't think she probably leaves the palace and goes shopping and doesn't really, did I bring my credit card? I don't think it really is an issue for her, but here's what she has to say about why digital ID is important for the poor people.
Successful, I would say, project in trying to sort of, get this thing going. And how do we actually attain this? Well, first of all, there have been about 60 plus countries that have actually had financial inclusion national strategies. And this has been an effort of actually different ministries, not only the Minister of Finance with the central bank governor, but also Ministry of Social Affairs, because it's, government to people payments that need to be done. The Ministry of Agriculture, because also agricultural policies that need to be considered. There are issues like, for example, sometimes education, there are sort of education stipends that are actually to be considered. So the Minister of Interior, because you need to have an ID to open an account. So this notion of actually getting sort of a coordination among ministries have actually really advanced the issues.
Sure.
Why? Because in order to open an account, you need to have an ID.
Right.
And I have to say that when I started this job, there were actually very little countries in Africa or Latin America that had one ubiquitous type of ID, and certainly that it was digital, and certainly that was biometric. And we've really worked with all our partners to actually help that being, to grow this. And the interesting part of it is that, yes, it is very necessary for financial services, but not only.
Sure.
It's also good for school enrollment. It's also good for health, who actually got a vaccination or not. It's very good to get your subsidies, from the government. So this has not only effect to the financial services, it's a very important issue.
Sure.
Digitalization has played, of course, a very important role. And I think we have here on my right a very good example of how it actually has been driven in Egypt. But it has basically brought the first two things: increased affordability by reducing the costs.
Sure.
And also the easiness, now you have your bank branch basically in the palm of your hands.
Sure.
Okay, well, and it's always interesting, like, her name is Queen Maximus. Why don't they ever call him like Queen de minimis or something like that? Or King Tiny or something like that. It never works out this way. Now, this is kind of good news. Tedros, the head of the World Health Organization, came out this week and says, these conspiracy theories, this pandemic treaty that we're trying to put in place by May fall apart because people are opposing it. And we've got to get it because, the world's got this. And they talked about a thing called disease exit at Davos. They had a session. I played a clip of that last week, Tedros speaking. So good news, people are fighting it. And it looks like maybe people are doing it. He said failure to strike an agreement would be a missed opportunity for which future generations may not forgive us. The implication being there may not be future generations if you don't give me the power that I really want. So this is an interesting little cartoon. Now, I'm not going to go through it in detail, but it's talking about, how many of you get annoyed with two-factor authentication when you're trying to get onto a website? Or you're trying to use your app to order food at a restaurant and you got to log in. It's like, what was the password? I don't remember the password. And you got to send it and reset it. And then they say, or you log into a website and it says, we sent a thing to your phone. Or sometimes in my case, it ends up, my wife goes, did you trying to get on this website? Because they sent a code to me and here's the code. So now they're talking about, well, maybe we need to have this kind of a satire 9-step authentication process. And then we're going to use voice recognition. And someone says, step 5, voice recognition, say a short, memorable phrase. And a guy in the middle says, down in the lower left, I love this. The guy in the middle says, I loathe this. And the gal there in the bottom right, pretty smart, she goes, a short, memorable phrase. Because they said, say a short, memorable phrase. And then there's this one here, the next panel over to the right, click only the happy snakes. And you do that, like click bridges, motorcycles, bicycles, traffic lights. And there's like this one little tiny piece. Does that count? Do you have to click on that? Yeah, you do have to click on that square, by the way. I know this. So this is another article. This is in the Wall Street Journal had a number of articles this week about artificial intelligence and can we control this? What are we going to do? How are we going to regulate it? And the answer really is, and they had a big debate in their, I think the Monday Wall Street Journal last week had a debate about, well, what do we do about controlling it? Do we control it or not control it? And everybody was on both sides of the issue. Well, if you control it, you're going to shut down innovation. If you don't control it, then they're going to control nuclear weapons with AI, and that's probably not a good thing to get the machines making all of those decisions. It's bad enough. This is another thing that goes along with the climate crisis. This is from Hudson Institute. America faces a looming LNG, liquefied natural gas, debacle. So the U.S. has become the world leader in LNG exports. In 2016, we didn't really even have any. So there were a couple of companies that started doing liquefied natural gas. Remember, there was a big explosion at a terminal down in Houston a little over a year ago. But liquefied natural gas has become a major export of the United States. And then, of course, Russia never got that pipe. Now, by the way, I have a sort of different view than some people. Yes, somebody blew up the Nord Stream pipeline. By the way, one of those lines was always ready to be used. And there were discussions, well, you're never going to get that. You're never going to get Nord Stream 2 open. And it never did. Germany would not agree to it, and Germany had to agree to it. But then somebody, to make sure Germany could never agree to it, they blew it up. But the word, by the way, is that Russia has been repairing it. But because of that, Germany needed natural gas because it gets cold in Germany in the winter. They've gone through a couple winters now since all this happened. Well, they're getting the liquefied natural gas from the United States at a much higher price, but it's benefiting some of the United States companies, but it's crashing the German economy. And Germany has cut back on natural gas usage, so much so that some of their big companies have just completely left and moved to Indonesia or China or Malaysia. And Germany is now considered to be one of the economies in the EU that's struggling the most, whereas 10 years ago, it was the cream of the crop. So it shows you how things can change quickly. And you also remember Israel was trying to build a pipeline to get its gas to Europe because it has some excess gas, and it has enough gas, they say, could last at current usage and projected growth the natural gas that that Israel has discovered off its coast in the Eastern Mediterranean could last 500 or 600 years. So they were going to sell some excess to Europe, and it would have been nice. Israel could have made money, but the pipeline never got built. The pipeline in the East Med, called the East Med Pipeline, they're very creative the way they name these things, never got built because a Biden administration official went to the finance companies, and the banks were going to get involved in this, and the countries that were involved, and said, we don't like this gas pipeline because we're getting away from hydrocarbons usage for energy. Oh, but you know what? By the way, that guy's name was Amos Hochstein. I think I've talked about this quite a bit. He, during the period after he left the Obama administration, he went and worked in the private sector. He was an executive vice president for a company in Houston that, lo and behold, I don't know why anybody doesn't investigate this, they do liquefied natural gas. Oh, isn't that convenient? So what do you think, if Trump wins this election, or whoever runs against Biden, or whoever runs in Biden's place? Anyway, do you think Hochstein maybe has a job to go back to if he needs to work anymore in his life? But it's just kind of convenient that, Israel, you can't do your gas pipeline because we don't really want to do gas. But, Germany, you need gas because of the Ukraine war. And the Nord Stream's not online. Well, here, buy from this company that I used to work at in Houston, because they're and people are making money hand over fist. So it's just kind of interesting the way those things. It's a miracle that it's worked out that way, I'm sure. But now Biden has come in and said we're going to shut down the LNG pipeline. And so in the UK, this article in the Times of London says, hey, wait a minute, what are you doing? How's this going to affect us? Because we import a lot of natural gas too, because they have environmentalists there, and they've shut down a lot of things. When I was in Scotland last year, people said, they're killing the oil and gas industry in the North Sea, which has really made a lot of people a lot of money in Scotland, but they don't seem to care about that. Okay, so geopolitics, I'll do this really quick. So this is a great article in the American Spectator. I started to talk a little bit about this last week. Putin's march to the Red Sea. Russian imperialism continues its push on the African front. And one of the things they talk about, one of the places that they're pushing Russian control is in the Central African Republic and in Libya. Libya's been in a civil war. And there's two warlords there's a UN-backed and there's a not UN-backed. And Russia's backing one, Turkey's backing the other. Who's going to get control of Libya? And Libya is a big oil and gas producer. But when we look at Bible prophecy and the end time scenario, one of which says Russia, an alliance with a bunch of countries coming down from the north, certainly Turkey's involved. Certainly Persia, Iran is involved. And some people say Russia's involved, some not involved. I kind of think that it is. That's my conclusion. But now we have Libya being brought into that alliance. That's kind of interesting. So Prigozhin, he got killed, and he had a bad flight and it didn't work. And I need to get through this more quickly. So this is an interesting article from the Times the other day in London. Week in West is sleepwalking towards a new era of conflict. A decade ago, the Cambridge historian Christopher Clark published a good book about the outbreak of the First World War. In my eyes, however, there was one thing wrong with the title. Wrong thing wrong with it. The title, The Sleepwalkers, suggested that in 1914, the leaders of Europe did not know what they were doing. In truth, one of the most ghastly aspects of the great nation's conduct that fateful summer in 1914 was that each believed they were acting rationally to promote or defend their national interests. Kaiser Wilhelm II, with his unerring instinct for the wrong gesture, opened champagne with his suite to celebrate Germany's declaration of war. Yet a future chronicler who writes of 2024 might justify the title of their own work, The Sleepwalkers. We are living in the most dangerous time, so unstable since the end of the Cold War. Governments posture relentlessly about their commitment to our security. The Defense Secretary, Grant Shapps, made an emotional speech last week about the threats facing us. He is, however, a member of a government with no apparent intention of doing anything about them. Do not be fooled by the NATO exercises to which Britain is making a brief troop commitment. The bombs dropped by the RAF Typhoons on Houthis in Yemen, the big talk about our warship, they have one aircraft carrier, or even occasionally warships deployed in the Red Sea. Now, and by the way, there was big articles this week also about the fact that they don't have enough people in their armed services. What are they going to do? They're declining, and populations are declining. It's going to happen without immigration. It would happen here. China's having this problem. Japan is having this problem. Japan's figured out, well, we're going to use robots to do what young people used to do. But all these populations are declining for the most part in the West, in the North, all at the same time. And so these people who have expansive ideas like Xi Jinping of China and other people, they see this decline. And are they going to act to cement their legacy? Because these guys are worried. They think, I don't think about this. Well, I do think about it. I think about it in the sense that I know I'll never appear in a history book anywhere. But these guys worry about how is history going to treat me? And it drives these guys who get into politics and that type of thing. So very interesting article. This is going around the EU. Putin's going to attack NATO within the next 5 to 8 years. And again, in Ukraine, they're talking about now the guys in the army, because so many have been killed off, they're older. So now they're calling it Dad's Army or Granddad's Army. So that war continues. Leaked German documents show leaders are preparing should Russia launch World War III. NATO to hold largest military exercises in decades, involving around 90,000 personnel. I don't know if Europe can come back. It's very expensive. I remember reports, it's probably better now, but there were reports a number of years ago, that Germany had 4 operational battle tanks. That'll really strike fear into the hearts of the Persians that are coming against Israel. And then this is a new nuclear doctrine that the Russians are coming out with. This is from the International Institute for Strategic Studies, published this week. It's Russia's changing its non-strategic nuclear weapons. That's what NSNW means. So this in Russia employs and continues to develop non-strategic nuclear weapons of varying types and ranges to provide a nuclear option at every rung of the escalation ladder. You remember what Putin said at the Valdiv dialogues back about 7 years ago? He said, listen, we won't use them in a first instance, but if we think you're using them before we are, we'll do it. And if we're wrong, you'll die and go to hell and we'll go to heaven. That's exactly what he said in that talk. So, and it talks about how Russia probably discounts this. This is a big deal. So Russia discounts the U.S. nuclear arsenal. They're talking about upgrading our arsenal, but then the question is, how do we test it? So they're trying to use artificial intelligence to test the nuclear weapons, because you're not allowed to do nuclear weapons testing. Kind of a bit of a conundrum. This is an interesting article. Wall Street, U.S. and partners are exploring seizing Russian assets to back loans to Ukraine. This is a very big deal if this happens, because there's a big push among the BRICS companies and others to get rid of the U.S. as the reserve currency of the world. Now, being the world's reserve currency, it has benefits. It helps us a lot to do, like, live beyond our means in the country as a whole. But there's a trade-off for that. You kind of got to be the world's policeman, at least on the seas, to guarantee open free and open shipping through all of these various choke points. So they want to take the Russian assets that have been frozen and just say, we're taking the assets. And they're frozen because they're in dollars. So our central bank thinks, and our government thinks we can do that. But if that's done, this may crash the dollar as the reserve currency. This is a very, very big deal. And it goes against the sort of unwritten agreement. If you're the world's reserve currency, like the Brits used to be with the pound sterling, and you have certain obligations to allow free flow of money and that type of thing. Now, people say, well, we don't like that because there's bad people transferring money. But that's sort of the trade-off that you have to do to be the reserve currency of the world. And if you're not the reserve currency of the world, things change dramatically. This is just kind of an interesting article. If you've ever been to the British Museum, they have the Cyrus cylinder, which talks about Cyrus taking over Babylon. It comes right out of the Bible, 539 BC. Remember the handwriting on the wall? That's all tied to the cylinder. By the way, I've seen the cylinder. It's not that big. So one of the articles says it's the size of a rugby ball. So I thought, okay, well, we'll see what it looks like as a rugby ball. So that'll kind of give you an idea. I love Photoshop. Okay, more about this in a moment. So Biden and Netanyahu are really in conflict on Gaza. Is that true or not? There was an article on Haaretz that said, that conflict is bogus. Nobody thinks there's going to be a Palestinian state or anything anytime soon. But maybe not. There's these attacks that are occurring up in Syria where U.S. troops are, and we can argue about whether U.S. troops should even be there. But these bombs are exploding. These guys are coming back with traumatic brain injuries. 60 Minutes did a good piece on this a couple of years ago. There's a lot of talk, too, about is the war going to erupt in the north on the border with Lebanon? I don't know how this happens, but this is an article from the Financial Times the other day that says Israel's foreign minister was asking embassies, or sent a letter to embassies of foreign countries in Tel Aviv saying, hey, do you have a generator? How much fuel do you have? How long can you operate that generator? Some people were thinking like that was sort of a veiled way of saying, we may be without power with all these rockets start flying from Hezbollah in Lebanon. So Hezbollah's attacked air base in the north at Mount Meron and elsewhere. There's a talk of a buffer zone. Israel wants to put a big buffer zone in Gaza. And I've seen interviews. Caroline Glick had a really good interview with a guy this week. And I can't remember who else had that. Anyway, in the interview, one of them interviewed a person who is this kibbutz resident down near Gaza. Now, the kibbutzes, they sort of grew out of a socialistic, communist, share everything. So, for example, at some kibbutzes, nobody owns a home. It's owned by the kibbutz. And you give to people according to their need. Everybody works and shares. And it kind of works, but they're largely peace-loving people. You could call them lefty peaceniks. That would be okay. They probably would say, hey, yeah, you got that right. That's what I am. But now there's some of the most vocal in Israel now saying, we used to have those people come over and help us all the time. Never again. It's never happening. Not in my or the next one or two generations. So how does this translate into the peace process? Back to the north, these people are concerned about, are people going to come back even if they get things resolved with Hezbollah? There's 100,000 people from the north that are living in hotels. From the, trying to remember where this one came from. Can the U.S. find allies to help in Gaza? The answer is maybe not. So everybody's getting involved. Everyone wants to we want to be the ones to make peace in Gaza. Here is the Joseph Borrell The EU minister, they had a big meeting last Monday in Brussels. Everybody was invited, so you see the reports on Tuesday. And Borrell was saying, oh, the Israeli guy came and he just proposed an artificial island off the coast of Gaza for everybody in Gaza to live on. That's not exactly what he said. It's about building an artificial island to serve as a harbor transit point for goods and that type of thing in the event that Gaza comes back. But of course, you know, he's Jewish, and so this Borrell is going to misinterpret everything. So here's what he had to say at a news conference around either before or just after this meeting took place.
They already presented a comprehensive approach. A comprehensive approach to what? I think that we have to stop talking about the peace process, and start talking more concretely about the two-state solution process. Because peace, it could be many different pieces. What kind of a peace you're talking about? So let's talk about what we want to do. And we want to do is to build a two-state solution. So let's talk about it. The way of naming, it's important. So from now on, I will not talk about the peace process, but about the two-state solution process. If we are serious about that, we have to study the underlying causes that prevent this solution of being implemented. And certainly Hamas is one of them, an important one. But there are others. And this comprehensive approach has to be studied and discussed. I know it's difficult, 27 have different approaches, but we have to work together with the Arab world. I know it's difficult, but it's our moral endeavor, our moral obligation to try to do our utmost to try to look for a solution. So from now on, please talk about the two-state solution process.
And he goes on and he has a 10-point plan, and he says, look, I know people don't agree with us, but we're pursuing this, and the implication was we're going to force Israel to do this. The Georgian foreign minister was also there. Here's what he had to say.
In Israel, with this current policy, with the current aggression on Gaza, with its continuation of measures to undermine the two-state solution, is dooming the future of the region to more conflict and more war. The whole world is saying the only way out of this misery is the two-state solution. So the party who's standing against the right of all peoples of the region, including Israelis, to have peace cannot just be left unaccountable. If the whole world says the only path forward is the two-state solution, then Israeli government says no to the two-state solution. So they're defying the whole international community, and I think it's about time that the world took a stand on the side of peace, on the side of the right of the region to live in peace and dignity and security.
Okay, this guy says this stuff all the time, and there are even people talking about, well, maybe we need to get rid of Bibi Netanyahu, then there will be peace for everybody. It's all Bibi's fault. Just like here, everything is Trump's fault. I mean, I saw these people, Trump's not even in office, and all these people running around, he's the one who's causing the border deal to fall apart. You know, and you know what Trump said was, yeah, I'll take credit for that. I'm the one who's interfering in that, sure. Here you see on the right, you see Raisi and Erdogan meeting this week in Ankara. They had a big meeting. They had a 10-point plan, agreement on cooperation. And this is a kind of a big deal. So here is Turkey. Erdogan is a big supporter of the Muslim Brotherhood. If you remember, the Muslim Brotherhood, Turkey, or Erdogan in Turkey, is going to be 70 on the 26th of February. He sent that ship over, remember, to kind of break through the Gaza blockade years ago. He spent a good 15 years putting his Islamic revolution in place. He's funded huge mosques here in the United States. Remember, they opened one in Maryland. I think they opened one in New York or Pennsylvania. And he came to it, and remember, his security guards beat up Secret Service guys at the White House. He's Muslim Brotherhood. Well, the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt thought they could compress what took Erdogan 15 years, so they did the revolution in Egypt, but then it didn't work, and al-Sisi kicked that guy out, whatever his name was, Morsi. But so here they have this big meeting, and they're talking about all these great things they're going to do. So it's a big deal. But the question remains, so two things we'll look at: Gaza process, and this is also the north because this is involved. This is the Lebanon is the dark area, and this border. So the plan right now is they're talking about it. Hezbollah would agree to withdraw north of the Litani River, which would be, so you see, let me get my famous laser pointer that you can't see anyway. So this peninsula up here, that's Beirut. Now, Israel saying, you got to withdraw all the way. But the Litani River kind of comes across, it comes down through the Bekaa Valley. It's kind of close to here where Metula and Kiryat Shimon is, and then it kind of goes over to the sea between Tyre and Sidon. And so they're saying they want everybody to withdraw all the way north of the Litani River. And will people then come back to the south? I mean, here's some statistics of some of the missiles that they're shooting. They've attacked Meron. And then there was so this is an unconfirmed rumor. Okay, so the Financial Times says this, hey, wait a minute, are you equipped for a security escalation in the north? And then all these open source intelligence guy goes, oh, they're talking about some unnamed Arab country has said that there's going to be, Israel's going to invade Lebanon. And I don't know if that's going to happen. They continue to interfere with shipping in the Red Sea. And this is kind of interesting because this comes from a open source intelligence guy called Megatron. This is how Saudi Arabia, Jordan, UAE, and Bahrain helped break the blockade imposed on ships bound for Israel through the Red Sea. Ships unload their cargo in Dubai and Bahrain, and then Arab trucks take the cargo to the Israeli crossing. This is the reason why the Houthis are preparing to close all three waterways, which would mean the Red Sea, the Straits of Hormuz, and the Mediterranean. And we don't seem to be mounting any kind of an effective response. It would seem to me that if you can pick up the missile in midair and shoot it down, that you ought to be able to sort of calculate where it came from and then just bomb the smithereens out of it. But we don't seem to be doing that. And a lot of people who talk about defense things say the United States is losing the naval battle in the Red Sea. So if we're the world's reserve currency to protect Red Sea shipping, and we're not doing a very good job, that's problematic. And so here's a map. This comes from Robert Kaplan's 2017 paper on Asia, Marco Polo. Look it up. You can find it online. It develops updates the Mackinder view. Halford Mackinder was a geologist. He wrote an article in 1904 for the Royal Geographic Society in England. And he talked about the pivot of history is this area up here. And so whoever controls this area controls this giant world island of Asia. Whoever controls that controls the world. And so that's why you see a lot of wars fought there. And that's why Putin knows this. And that's been updated. Henry Kissinger updated it. Zbigniew Brzezinski in his book, The Grand Chessboard, updated it. And then Kaplan updated it in an essay that he wrote for the U.S. government and also in his, he wrote a book. He was at the World Economic Forum and talked about the revenge of geography or something like that. Very smart guy. So this was a bad week, though, for Israel in Gaza. One explosion They were wiring some buildings to detonate them, and apparently a rocket was shot at a tank and it hit the explosions, and 21 reserve soldiers were killed in one explosion. So you see the Jerusalem Post, everything is in black on the front page. And this is devastating. I mean, this is, but Hamas and the pro-Palestinian, pro-terrorist people, this is what they put up. This is a poster in Tehran. You see the dead bodies and the menorah bending over in flames. That's on a street in Tehran. At Palestinian Square, by the way. So it's, this was also in an Arab newspaper. And you see an RPG being shot through the heart of the IDF. You get the symbolism there. They're really good editorial cartoonists. Now, this is someone posting based on some reports from Israeli Channel 12. Report of a few developments in the past few hours. This was posted on Thursday. The leadership of Hamas is losing hope, and they're realizing that things will not go back to 10-6. They know Israel will never allow any money from Qatar or any other countries to come to Gaza as long as Hamas is there. IDF's impressive gains in Khan Yunis made them believe that the end is near. This is after the explosion killed the 21 reservists, and there were 24 killed that one day. That was the biggest toll of one day in the war. The announcement by Israel this week that they are creating a buffer zone in Gaza, which means Hamas lost land, is a devastating blow to them. Their fight is to gain ground, and now they have lost more land, and they can never declare a victory. This is worse for them than losing people or leadership, and you can see it in their nervous and angry statements. So I'm going to go 10 minutes over, probably. That's not a prophecy, okay? But, so Piers Morgan interviewed a doctor from the National Health Service in the UK about this war in Gaza. This is a very interesting exchange. I've got about a 4-minute clip. You can find the 21 minutes of Piers yelling at the guy, and justifiably so. So just listen to a couple minutes of this.
How can you categorize a terror attack in which 1,200 mostly innocent civilian people were brutally attacked, raped, tortured, beheaded, and murdered? How can you, a British NHS doctor or NHS doctor in Britain, how can you say that's a welcome punch on the nose?
Will you let me answer fully?
Yes.
I will be frank. I'll be as concise as I can be. But if you give me the courtesy of letting me answer fully.
Okay.
I will defend the right of the Palestinians to resist an occupation. When you look at that...
That's not resistance, that's terrorism.
When you look at what happened on the 7th of October, as if that is the day that everything started...
I didn't say that.
You didn't say that, but when people look...
Do you think what happened that day was a terrorist attack?
When people look...
Do you? Do you?
The word terrorism has become so... politicized.
Actually, not really.
The word
you can be
terrorism,
deeply sympathetic to the plight of Palestinian civilians, which I am, by the way, and have expressed many times. What you can't do is be weaselly-mouthed about what happened on October the 7th.
I asked you to let me finish.
That was a grotesque
I will ask you to finish.
Yeah, but you're equivocating about it being a terror attack.
I'm not equivocating, and I will explain why. Okay, the word terrorism, by the way, in India last month.
We're not talking about India. Talking about what's
The
happened
word
here.
terrorism in India. People who supported the Australian cricket team have been arrested under terrorist offences. In the West Bank, people who are have been told, if you reveal what happened in the prisons, you will be arrested on terrorist.
Do you think what happened on October the 7th was a terror attack?
It's a
Did you say no?
It's a resistance.
Not a terror attack.
But Piers, and it's
You're NHS GP.
if I'm asking you to let me finish, right, our Islamic standard in conflict, in warfare, our Prophet, peace be upon him, sallallahu alayhi wasallam, he said, you can't kill children, you can't kill women, you can't kill the elderly, you can't mutilate.
Hamas did all that.
If anybody did that,
What do you mean if?
I say if because
They literally broadcast it on their own streaming platforms.
well, I'll tell you what a lot of us saw.
Hamas broadcast it merrily to the world. Here's us doing these terrible things.
and
What do you mean if?
What many of us saw on that day were
By the way, good on Piers Morgan for challenging that guy. By the way, Tucker Carlson, when you interview anti-Semites, Candace Owens, that's how you do it. Not this softball stuff, okay? Challenge their ridiculous notions that they have. And this is common. This is the propaganda. This is our narrative put out by Hamas this week. And it talks about Operation Al-Aqsa Flood. And they have this, I'm going to show you some quotes. You heard what the guy said. If they did it, we're not allowed to kill women and children. And so we didn't do that. And Pierce goes, they broadcast it on live Telegram channels, live. Well, I don't know that they did that. That's AI generated by Israel. I mean, this is what you should come and look at my Twitter feed sometime. And so here's what they said. Operation Al-Aqsa Flood targeted the Israeli military sites. I've been to these kibbutzes. They are not military sites. It's where people live and farm. They have gardens, they raise eggs, they have tractors to do things in the fields, and sought to arrest the enemy soldiers to pressure the Israeli authorities to release thousands of Palestinians held in jails through a prisoner exchange. Avoiding harm to civilians, especially children, women, and elderly people, is a religious and moral commitment by the Al-Qassam Brigade fighters. We reiterate that the Palestinian resistance was fully disciplined and committed to the Islamic values during the operation. These guys are liars, in addition to being cold-blooded killers. And Blinken and Biden are running around over there saying, hey, you need to establish a Palestinian state there. Anybody who does that is insane. In fact, I just got this a tweet this morning. I think Caroline Glick tweeted it. And it says here, this is the problem. Biden appoints former Palestinian UNRWA, UNRWA, I'll talk about them in just a minute, official as director of NSC intelligence. He served on President Barack Obama's National Security Council as Director for Israeli and Palestinian Affairs and as Deputy to Samantha Power. He is the new Director of the National Security Council Intelligence Service in the United States of America. If you vote for a Democrat, there's plenty of things look, tough decision. This one ought to be easy. If you vote for a Democrat, you deserve everything that comes with it. And what you've seen with Tony Badrin and Michael Doran and others writing for 2 years about the Iranian influence operation going on in our State Department. And Blinken and Amos Hochstein and Jake Sullivan, they're all guilty. They need to go for our own security and safety. But look at what they said here. Look at this, point 3. Maybe some faults happened during Operation Al-Aqsa Flood's implementation due to the rapid collapse of the Israeli security and military system and the chaos it caused along the border areas with Gaza. In other words, Israel responded and our people got confused and maybe made some mistakes. As attested to by many, the Hamas movement dealt in a positive and kind manner with all civilians who have been held in Gaza. Let's see. When the Israeli occupation promoted point 4 allegations that the Al-Qassam brigades on October 7th were targeting Israeli civilians are nothing but complete lies and fabrications. The source of these allegations is the Israeli official narrative. and no independent source proved any of them. I see this all the time, these ridiculous terrorist-supporting people on Twitter. They go, oh, well, where's the proof that anybody was raped? There's nobody come forward to testify. Yeah, you killed them. That's why they didn't come forward to testify. This kind of gets me a little bit upset. And I have a lot of stuff. So there was a ruling by the International Court of Justice. It said Israel shouldn't commit genocide. I'll talk more about that in the future. Here's some of the, you see everybody was talking about it. All the Arab press, European press, in Iran, they're calling it Gaza's victory in The Hague. Al-Akbar and Al-Quds newspaper, the Palestinian Authority newspaper on the left, the Al-Akbar, the Hezbollah mouthpiece from Lebanon on the right. And they had a big section on it in a special section on Friday in the Al-Akbar. And then this kind of editorial cartoon, which is kind of, this is what the Arab press says. They're emphasizing this all the time. But it was not a super bad decision. There was an Israeli judge. The vote was 17 judges, 15-2 against Israel on most of the points. The Israeli judge did agree, so there were a couple points, mainly humanitarian aid, that the Israeli judge, who's a leftist, a lot of people wonder why Netanyahu appointed him. Somebody said, well, if they appointed a really right-wing judge, that nobody would have listened to him in The Hague. And maybe this is true, but he went with the court majority, the other 15, on a couple of humanitarian aid decisions that they rendered. But there was one judge, she's from Uganda, and she voted against South Africa on every issue. And of course, the Uganda government immediately came out and said, her ruling at the International Court of Justice does not represent the government of Uganda's position on the situation in Palestine. Buddy, you better hope that it does. Because there are consequences to these things that we see. So here's this. So what Israel has claimed, listen, some of these people that work for UNRWA, the UN agency, they were helping the terror. They were terrorists themselves. So the UN came out and said, we're firing 10 of them. That's right. Oh, but one of them's dead already anyway. So, but that's not the extent of, and so Guterres at the UN can say, oh, look, we got everything taken care of. Look how wonderful we are. We're so concerned about Israel and being fair and everything. So we fired 10 of these people, but one of them's already dead, so he's not really working anyway. He may be voting in some future elections, but he's dead, or she's dead. UN Watch published this last week. UNRWA's teacher, not last week, 2 years ago they published this, UNRWA's Teachers of Hate. You can look it up on the UN Watch, I think it's unwatch.org website. But also, if you want to see what's being taught to these kids in Palestinian schools, PalWatch, which is Itamar Marcus, who I got to talk to some in Jerusalem last year. Great website. They translate all of these. Memory translates a lot of these. And then there's I think it might be a Canadian outfit or Swedish outfit called Impact-SE. And they pull examples out of the textbooks that would shock you. So they named the top 10 teachers that were involved in this. And you can see some of the things, So one of these guys calls for the killing of Jews and quotes the Quran that says, the last hour will not come until the Muslims fight against the Jews, until a Jew will hide himself behind a stoner tree, and the stoner tree will say, oh, Muslim, there is a Jew behind me, come and kill him. But there seems to be this push for peace. So I'm going to play 2 clips. These are going to take about 16 minutes. So going to go over. Everybody says, go longer. And So here is a Saudi Arabian princess speaking at the World Economic Forum. And the question is, what happens to the Abraham Accords? Why is this going on? And what is going on? Are the Abraham Accords dead? And a lot of people say they're dead. I don't think they are. And so listen to what she says. And remember, the king is still alive. I think things will change when the king passes on. But here's her January 18th at the World Economic Forum.
I think the most important thing to realize is the kingdom has not put normalization at the heart of its policy. It's put peace and prosperity at the heart of its policy. So that looks at resolving the finite cause of the Palestinian people who deserve a state. They deserve sovereignty. They deserve a pathway that is irrevocable to their situation. Today, you're talking about 30,000 people who've died. Let's talk about those who are living, the children whose limbs are amputated, the people who are hiding in churches. That is not okay in any society to have sewage running around. This is not a solution to peace. This is not a solution to sovereignty. It's also not a path to safety. And while the kingdom fully recognizes the need for Israel to feel safe, it cannot be at the expense of the Palestinian people. So in our plight, in our journey over the past, and not since October 7th, as horrible and vile and disgusting as what happened that day was, we have to go to the root cause of the instability in the region. 75 years of occupation. Those 75 years led to a plethora and an outroar and a spilling of violence across our region. To your point, it's not complicated. The solution is obvious, and the solution is now. And the solution is a two-state solution. The kingdom, since the time of King Fahd, has pushed forward with that policy. Since the Arab proposal of peace, we've pushed with King Abdullah for that policy. And you heard the Crown Prince say in his own voice, we've never been closer than we were before. But today, cooler heads must prevail. There's trauma and pain on both sides. I can't take that back. But what we can do is cease fire now.
And she talked about peace and prosperity and safety. And those words, and remember, this is the Trump plan, peace to prosperity. 4 years ago, this week, it came out. So this, I'm going to conclude with this. I have tons more, but I think we need to discuss, or you need to see this. So I've become a fan of this podcast. I listen to Caroline Glick and Melanie Phillips and JNS, Jonathan Tobin. They do a great job, great discussions. Highly recommend you go to JNS, JN, as in Nancy S, YouTube channel. Your IQ will go up by listening to their podcast. Also, Michael Doran and Gadi Taub do a thing called Israel Update, Israel at War on Rumble. You can watch them. They do about, 45 or 90 minutes a week. But it's good stuff. They're conservative. They're good thinkers. And I don't agree with them on everything. That's the thing you need to understand. So this podcast by Dan Senor called Call Me Back. And I like intelligent conversation. I think this is intelligent conversation. So he regularly interviews almost every week Haviv Rettig-Gur of the Times of Israel. And I don't know his orientation. I will tell you there's been some things that he said that irritate me that I think are not correct, but that's okay. He seems like a really decent guy. And so I'm going to play about this. This was on Call Me Back, and you can get it at unlock.fm, and I'll try to put the link in the show description below this. And I'll probably conclude with this. It may take about 15 minutes. And somebody says, will you just play it and stop talking? So here we go. This was 100 days. This was part 2 of their discussion on Israel at War, 100 days. And this talks about the Arab problem. I think this is pretty good.
All the ridiculous criticisms of Israel and the images on Al Jazeera and
this is Dan Senor
and other media organizations, including mainstream Western news organizations, that are totally and utterly hysterical and disproportionate. You want to use the word disproportionate? The media reaction to what Israel's doing is where there's a lack of proportion. And yet, the Saudi ambassador says, absolutely, it's moving forward or it can move forward. Does that surprise you?
It does not surprise me. The reason it does not surprise me is that I think that when this is something that frustrates me generally and for a very long time. I think that when Western diplomats talk about the Middle East, they themselves are fascinated with process because they all get degrees at universities that teach them to think of international affairs as process, as complex layered strategies, as interests and power and all of these paradigms for looking at how people think through what is happening to them and how they're going to react to what is happening to them. But in the Middle East, and I think everywhere, and I think this is true of all people, but I'll speak to people I kind of know, people think in stories. People think identities. And they think about grand strategy in stories and identities. The Abraham Accords are something very, very deep. And it took me quite a long time to understand how deep, and it took me being led by the hand by some Muslim friends and people thinking about it who know a great deal more than me to really get to a sense of it. If you are the Saudis, what does the Middle East look like to you right now? What does the Israel-Gaza war look like to you right now? And I think that the answer is that we talked about this a little bit in the past, so I apologize. I'm going to maybe cover a tiny bit of ground for half a second just to make the point. The Muslim world for well over a century has been asking itself one immense, overpowering, enormous question. And it's a question whose answers have produced a lot of what the Arab and Muslim, larger Muslim world is today. And the question is, what happened to us? What happened to Islam? Why is the Muslim world generally, the Muslim world is so vast that to talk about it as a single thing is a little silly. I have to do it just for the purpose of the conversation. Apologies to Muslims. This is obviously a cartoonish simplification of very big and complex and massively diverse discourse. But this question of what happened to Islam is fundamental. And the great thinkers and the great theologians of the Muslim world have been talking about it for 150 years because of European imperialism, because of power moving out of Islam, because of the science moving out of Islam, because of economic progress moving out of Islam to other parts of the world. And the reason that this really bothers theologians is that Islam is born as a conquering empire. The Prophet himself in his lifetime is a conquering emperor. And for centuries, one of Islam's fundamental arguments, its basic arguments for its own divinity, for its own truth, is the astonishing success on the battlefield. It's the astonishing expansion of the religion in ways that Muslims themselves couldn't explain in real time in the 7th and 8th centuries. And so the question today that Muslims ask, or 100 years ago that Muslims ask of Islamic weakness, is a profound question because it's the question essentially, are we and our God detaching? Are we distant from our God and God's plan for history? And what do we do to get back to divine grace? To get back divine grace which is proven to us, shown to us by our worldly power, because that's how Islam begins. My favorite example that really wraps up this discourse in terms of Israel, everything that the Muslim world thinks and talks and says about Israel, it helps me a great deal to think of it in that lens, because suddenly it becomes rational. And suddenly a lot of the hypocrisy that we see in the Muslim world, the Muslim world is protesting in massive numbers in all these cities and all these capitals about Gaza, but you didn't have these protests for the Houthi war in Yemen, where 85,000 children were starved to death and the Houthis didn't care, or for the genocide underway by Assad in Syria, where he just tried to physically destroy or push out enough Sunnis that they could never threaten the Alawites.
To be clear, hundreds of thousands of Sunnis in Syria, Sunni Muslims, like Sunni Palestinian Arabs. So all this concern about the plight and the suffering of Sunnis, hundreds of thousands of slaughtered, millions driven out, and barely any attention given to it, and Assad now welcomed back into the Arab League.
It shows the
Right.
growth of
And
Islam.
by the way, the scale of the Syria disaster, I mean, people just decided to forget instantly. 10% of Syria's population was Christian in 2011 before the civil war. It's now 2%, and the population itself has shrunk. And so why doesn't the Muslim world care? Never mind why doesn't the West care, or Western progressives who draw a lot of their discourse from this oppressor-oppressed decolonization kind of paradigm, but why don't Muslims care? And it isn't even a question of Muslim on Muslim violence versus Muslim on non-Muslim violence. In other words, it's not that non-Muslims are doing the killing of Muslims in Gaza, because you have Myanmar committing essentially a genocide against the Rohingya, Buddhist Myanmar against the Muslim Rohingya people in the north, pushing 700,000 of them brutally into Bangladesh, and the Muslim world doesn't utter a peep. In other words, it just didn't matter. It wasn't the suffering of Muslims at the hands of non-Muslims. Israelis look at that and they say, aha, they don't care about Gazans. They don't really care about Gazans. If my name was Assad, I could kill 3 times as many Gazans. They wouldn't care. I try not to. Assad didn't try not to. His whole point was to. So they don't really care about Palestinians. This is about anti-Semitism. But it's not that simple. In other words, that's a very comforting thought for Israelis, but it's more complicated. And what it actually is, it explains Iran today, explains a great deal of the war that is coming, explains what Israelis woke up to on October 7th. In 1898, there was a theologian, one of the most important founders of Salafi thought, of this kind of radical, ascetic, pious Islamic renewal thinking that produced the Wahhabis of Saudi Arabia and produced Al-Qaeda and produced the Muslim Brotherhood over the decades, and would come to produce a lot of these what movements that would be called extremist or radical or whatever, but what they really are is an answer to the question, what happened to us? And what happened to us was that we grew far apart from deep Islam, real Islam, original Islam, and if we return to a pious old Islam, if we, for example, do away with the nation states that the Western imperialists forced on us, right? The British literally invented the idea of Iraq. The French invented the idea of Lebanon. If we sweep all that away and we are one unified caliphate, we come back into our own. We come back into God's grace, and therefore we come back into power in history. And that basic idea, which was borrowed from the Sunnis by the Shia regime in Iran, by the ideological movement that would found this revolutionary regime in Iran, that basic idea, Rashid Rida in 1898, he's a very serious and thoughtful and deep thinker. He's also a jurist in Islamic law. And he's sitting in Cairo, British-controlled Cairo in 1898, and he's following very carefully the first Zionist Congress minutes of the year before. And his response to the Zionist movement's founding in Basel was fascinating. By the way, at the beginning, he is pro-Zionist. He thinks that the Zionists, the Jews, will come here and they'll help the Arabs in their effort to kick out the imperialists. But then he begins to understand that they really actually are going to found a nation state in Palestine. And he writes in a journal, a very, very influential journal that he founded that very year in Cairo, Al-Manar. This is a letter he is writing in his journal to Arabs in Palestine. He writes, you complacent non-entities, you're going to allow the weakest, the most impoverished, the most pathetic of all peoples to come and to take your land and to be masters in that land. His problem with Zionism, this is a man living in British-controlled Egypt. He is not desperately upset that one of the most powerful empires in all of human history controls him. That's just a question of, history going back and forth. But the problem of Palestine, for him, is the problem of Islamic weakness. You know how you see Islam weak? If the Jews, the refugees, the refuse, he literally writes there, they're kicking them out from every country, penniless and weak. And they're going to come and take over and push back Islam and conquer a piece of Islam. How weak is Islam? That the penniless undesirables and paupers of the West can push it back. So the problem with the Jews, it's not about the Jews. It's about the fact that even Jews can push back Islam. And so, for example, for the Iranian regime today, the problem of Israel isn't that Israel exists. It's that Israel cannot be destroyed by Muslims. If it could be destroyed by Muslims, it wouldn't have to be destroyed by Muslims, because it wouldn't be this standing symbol of Islamic weakness and therefore of distance from God. And so the path to Islamic redemption and renewal and a return to history as a powerful agent of history cuts through a bloody path through what they call Jewish arrogance, which is what Israel is to them. And they use that word arrogance all the time. Khamenei uses it in every speech. And so the reason that a lot of these crowds in Muslim countries, it isn't everyone, it maybe isn't most, but the reason that Muslim communities, Muslim countries will see these massive protests against Israel, ostensibly for suffering, because of suffering or for Palestinian rights, why would the Iranian regime, which doesn't believe in rights for its own people, bother with Palestinian rights and invest in it billions and billions that it doesn't have in a years-long, expensive multi-front war for Palestinian rights? Because it has nothing to do with Palestinian rights. It has to do with allowing Islam to come back as a force in history and proving that they are not far and distant from their God. Their whole point is to return Islam to God's embrace. And as long as Israel exists, that's obvious evidence. That's incontrovertible evidence. Because the Jews are so weak, that's incontrovertible evidence that Islam does not, in fact, have God's grace. And so for Hamas, on October 7th, the humiliation, the videotaping, and the broadcasting live of the humiliation was the core message. And for Israelis, the sense of vulnerability was the message they took away, because that was the message Hamas was sending. By the way, also rhetorically, they were saying it openly. Now you see that we are opening the gates of hell under you. You see how weak you are. You are the spider's web, as Nasrallah calls it. What is the Abraham Accords? Over the last 20 years, the Saudis and the Emiratis and others, the conservative Sunni regimes, Jordan, Morocco, they have understood the destructive, the disastrous potential contained in these visions of Islamic renewal that we often call radical or extremist. The Muslim Brotherhood axis of Sunni governments, Qatar, Erdogan's government in Turkey, the Muslim Brothers of Egypt. Hamas is an offshoot of the Muslim Brothers of Egypt. And these conservative regimes have understood how utterly devastating. These are regimes that destroy their own countries. And these are ideologies that destroy countries and have perpetual war at their heart. And they've turned on them. After 9/11, this began with the Saudis in a big way, where it turned on the Islamists, it turned on the Salafis and the Wahhabis and all these different kinds and turns and shades of groups.
It stopped funding madrasas. It stopped funding extremist leaders in mosques, not only in Saudi Arabia, but around the world, everywhere from Islamabad to London. It had been the primary sponsor of what you're describing, and they shut it down.
Absolutely. And so validating Israel, accepting Israel, isn't a geopolitical step only. It's really convenient to have Israel on your side if you are anyway going to be the archenemy of Iran within the Arab world. Because Israel is powers analogous to America, an order of magnitude smaller, but still similar in tech, savvy and things like that. Israel also has the huge advantage that America doesn't have, which is that Israel can't leave. And so Israel is a more useful ally in that sense than America if you're the Saudis. Israel is a great thing to have, in your quiver if you're ever facing the Iranians again, like they were in Yemen. But there's a much, much deeper and more long-term point that they're making. And it's almost a battle for the soul of Islam within the Arab world. And it's the argument that we refuse to measure the value of Islam or the value of our faith or the value or God's judgment and plan for history or our closeness to God and whether we are still within divine grace. We refuse to put that, to hang all of that on whether we manage to massacre all the Jews. That itself, that measuring stick, is pathetic. That measuring stick is a powerful signal of Islamic weakness. You, the regime of Iran, you, this radical ideology, is our weakness, is our shame. We want to build and we want to show the world what we can build and we want to have companies and investments and high tech, and that's what you want to show Islam modern. Show Islam modern. Don't turn Islam into Daesh, into ISIS. And so there is an argument here that is louder and is serious and is deep, and accepting Israel is a kind of recovery. If you accept Israel, you don't have to be obsessed with Israel. If you accept Israel, you don't have to measure your own spiritual validity by your relationship with Israel. It's just another little country, not even a big one. It's just another place in the world. And it's not our story. Our story doesn't have to be a story of whether we can or cannot destroy Israel. And so the Abraham Accords are a kind, for the people advancing it, what surprised me about the Emirati peace, the normalization with the Emiratis, wasn't that they made the peace. Okay, they made the peace. That makes sense. There are other Arab countries that made peace with us for strategic reasons, never liked us. They invited Israelis. They made a point of showing that Israelis can come to Abu Dhabi and have fun and relax and enjoy themselves and do business. They sent an ambassador, and then that ambassador visited museums with journalists in Israel. It was about showing that this is real peace. It was about recovering from the addiction to the question of Israel as a proxy for the question of Islamic weakness. And so the Saudis are still on board. I wouldn't say they're still on board. I would say they are tripling down. They're desperate for us to win this. Because the argument within the Muslim world that Israel is the testing ground for Islam coming back into God's grace, that argument has to die. And the only way for that argument to die is to fail disastrously. And so they want Israel to make that argument fail disastrously.
So I don't know about you, but I just found that to be a very intelligent, thoughtful discussion analysis. And now that doesn't mean I'm on board with the Abraham Accords, because I see a potential trap there. But you understand the prescient administration that we had up through early 2021 was talking about this in these terms, maybe not so directly as Mr. Gur did in his interview with Dan Senor. But so anyway, you can follow this podcast, and you can get it on Apple Podcasts, and there's a lot of discussions there. And one of the things that Mr. Gur said in another interview, he said that the outcome of October 7th wasn't that Israel's running around, oh, we're weak, we're terrible, we're bad, oh, we're going to be destroyed. He said it made Israel more fierce. And that's a very interesting take on it. So there's a lot of unity there, but it's starting to fray at the edges. But this is a very, very interesting time. Think of what's going on and the implications, as I've talked about, with the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan plan that the Saudis have posited, and moving away from the Temple Mount as an Islamic historical site. And we'll focus back in what we think of the historical site in Mecca and Medina. And Saudi Arabian, come, spend your money here. Don't go to Jerusalem. And then we have the red heifers and all this other stuff. So there's a lot to talk about. And I'm just saying, what you're seeing here in that interview and what's going on in Gaza right now, and maybe will be going on in Lebanon pretty soon, is a huge, huge shift in the Islamic. It's a war within the Islamic world. That's Israel's kind of the proxy for the Sunni Arabs that want to end this. And give him credit, Jared Kushner and Mohammed bin Salman. After 9/11, that was a tipping point, and Saudi Arabia changed to some extent. But now we're one generation beyond that. And soon a grandson of Saud appears to be taking the throne in Saudi Arabia. At very interesting times to live. I cannot recommend this and other things more highly. And I've gone way too long. I appreciate your indulgence. And I would have done it even if you didn't thank me for it. So let's pray. Tuesday, 2:00 with Tom Hughes. And I'm trying to set up some interviews of other people. Oh, I'm Kurt Reed on Thursday at, I think, 1:30. Be live with him. So let's pray, and we'll get back. I think this topic will come up again, don't you? Let's pray. Lord, thank you so much for your word. Thank you for allowing us the privilege of living in such a significant time in biblical and prophetic history. Lord, I pray that you will help us to recognize the significance of that. Look at the acceleration, convergence of all these things that are going on that were prophesied, but help us to take that as a motivation to live holy lives and to share the gospel with those around us, because the eternal destiny of a lot of people may be determined in the not too distant future. Help us to always keep that in mind. Give us strength, courage, extra measure of your Holy Spirit to be wise in the way we walk. Bless us this week in Jesus' name. Amen.